on YouTube for the benefit of anybody who misses class. Okay, so. Effect, literary significance. If you remember, the way Tolkien begins the fairy story essay, to go back to the very beginning, he raises three questions. He asks, what are fairy stories? What is their origin? And what is the use of them? Okay? And how does he answer those three questions? First one, what are fairy stories? Anybody remember how he essentially answers it?
Fairy stories take place. It's where they take place, like in the land of fairy. It doesn't necessarily need a fairy in it.
Right, doesn't have to have a fairy.
He talks a lot about what it's not. Like, it's not just about really tiny fairies. It's not about necessarily their size and the details you get hung up on.
It's essentially a story from the perilous realm, to use the phrase Tolkien uses. He doesn't define fairy story, right? Keep in mind what the word define means. It means to put a limit around, to put a boundary around. He never does that. He says, essentially, you cannot define fairy stories. He's essentially like the Supreme Court Justice, I think it was either Holmes or Jackson, who said when a pornography or obscenity case came before him, I cannot define obscenity, but I know it when I see it. That's essentially what Tolkien says about fairy stories. Okay? So, the second question deals with their origins. What is their origin? What's his ultimate answer?
They've always been.
Kind of essentially they've always been. And it doesn't really matter what their origin is. And that's that whole section he goes on, he talks about the cauldron of soup. You know, you throw everything in, you throw bits and pieces in, you throw a king who's gone away and hasn't returned, you throw in a hero from here, you throw in this element, you throw in a magical sword, you let it cook for a few hundred years, and you end up with Arthur. Or you end up with Aragorn. Okay, depending on how you want to look at it. Or you end up with a whole bunch of figures from literary history. Okay? And he doesn't do that to say that researching the origins of stories is bad. He says, you know, I like to do this as much as anybody else. But it doesn't really answer the most important question, which is the third question. What is the importance of these stories for us today? Or as he puts it, what is the use of them? And it's in answering that question of the use of stories that Tolkien goes on to talk about children. Right? But when he does address children, he begins by saying, I will now turn to children and so come to the last and most important of the three questions. What, if any, are the values and functions of fairy stories now? Notice how he modifies the question. Originally he said, what is the use of them now? That becomes modified to, what are the values and functions of them now? Okay? And notice he's doing this in the context of children. Why?
Most people relate them to fairy tales like Little Red Riding Hood.
Exactly. Most people relate fairy tales to children. In other words, fairy tales aren't meant for us. We're adults. We're grown-ups. We shouldn't have any need of fairy stories. St. Paul says, when I was a child, I thought as a child. Okay? Now that I'm grown up, I don't think as a child anymore. In other words, it's time to get away from the milk and start eating good, chewy, solid food. Okay? So Tolkien then asks the question, is there any essential connection between children and fairy stories? Notice, essential. What does that word ultimately mean?
Absolutely necessary.
Okay, what's the root of it?
The essence.
The essence. Is there something in the essence of fairy stories that ties them to children? What do fairy stories not have to have? Fairies. Okay. So can you write a fairy story that doesn't have anything to do with fairies? Yes. So what would make it necessarily relatable to children? Why children? Okay. And so Tolkien goes on to talk about how children have become associated with fairy stories over the years. And he says it's an accident of our domestic history. Domestic meaning household, the home of a family. How do fairy stories accidentally get relegated to children? He uses an analogy from another aspect of family life. What do you do when you have an old piece of furniture that isn't quite yet ready to be thrown away? You put it up in a kid's room or in the nursery, as he calls it, so that the children can bounce around on it, etc. You're no longer really concerned about the furniture. Okay? So it gets cast off to children. Well, how do fairy stories get cast off to children? And when? He doesn't answer the question of when, but I think it's kind of important to think about. It's not in the 1400s. It's not in the thousands. It's not in the 800s. It's not in the 1500s. It's not really even in the 1600s. It's during the Enlightenment that this happens. Yes?
Does it happen when people are more concerned with like stylistic aspects of their writing fairy stories? Like the fairy stories become bad and don't really endure, so...
To some extent. But I think it's more of what C.S. Lewis will call an intellectual snobbery. In other words, the fairy stories are not appropriate for adults because they are about what?
The unreal.
Unreal things. And what should adults be reading about?
Science.
Facts. Real life. We ought to be wrestling with the problems of real life. The whole, realist movement, naturalist movement of beginning really in the 1850s, all the way up to the postmodern, in my opinion, crap of today. Okay? Which are about life as it really is. In other words, there isn't any magical fairy who's going to come rescue us from the problems of our world. And you can define magical fairy any way you want. You can define it, this is kind of according to the tenets of naturalism and stuff. You can define that as God, you can define that as an angel, you can define that as a little, furry-footed, half-pint person who pops out of a hole in the ground. Okay? So, why do they get relegated to children? Children believe things more easily, right? Do they have a better developed sense of imagination? No. They have an unclouded imagination. They have an unjaded imagination. See, the problem that happens is, generally, is as we get older, we get more jaded. As we get older, we give less credibility to things around us. Okay? Tolkien's going to say that essentially one of the things children have that we don't is they have less experience of the world. Isn't that, after all, why today in grade schools we see school districts and governing boards, etc., placing so much emphasis on telling the precious little dears about how horrible people are out there? Don't take anything from anybody. Don't walk along with anybody you don't know. Don't. So that we're essentially, by the age of 6 or 7, or 8 or 9, if we're teaching them how to use condoms and such in schools, what are we preparing them for? Things that they don't need to be prepared for, really, at 8 or 9 years old. We're turning them into a bunch of 30-year-olds in 10-year-old bodies. Okay? So, Tolkien says, yes, in our day and age, fairy stories have been written and adapted for children. And he's thinking of people like Andrew Lang, the guy for whom he's delivering this lecture in his honor, essentially. Okay? But Tolkien essentially says, just because that's what's going on, it doesn't mean that's how it should be. Because if you go back in history, most stories that are considered fairy stories weren't written for children. Okay? Cinderella was not a children's story. Sleeping Beauty was not a children's story. The Grimm's collection, meaning the collection of the brothers Grimm, was not intended for children. It was intended for adults. And they were stories that they got from adults. They didn't go to the little schoolhouses in Bavaria and other parts of Germany and sit down with the children and say, now tell me a story, and sit there and transcribe it. They went to adults to find out the stories they had heard and had been passing down. Okay? So, Tolkien has to address children. And he says, okay, it is true. Maybe children are capable, of course, of literary belief. That is, believing that the story you are telling them is true. With my oldest child, who's now a student here, and even with the second, I've got 4, and even with the second, when they first read the Harry Potter stories, my daughter, who began reading Harry Potter, I think when she was in 2nd grade, when she turned 11, she was sure she was going to get a letter. Okay? She had acquired that literary belief. It wasn't real world belief. That is, she knew up here Hogwarts wasn't real. But man, did she want it to be real. Okay? So Tolkien says, the kind of literary belief that we're talking about here is what has been called the literary suspension, the willing suspension of disbelief. Anybody know who coined that phrase? It wasn't Tolkien. It was Samuel Taylor Coleridge, romantic poet and literary theorist. Pretty good one at both. Okay. Coleridge said that when you work or read of literature, or when you read a work of literature, what you do is you willingly suspend disbelief. In other words, you pick up Ivanhoe, if you've ever read it, Sir Walter Scott. You pick up Ivanhoe, you intentionally tell your mind, okay, I am about to read a work of fiction. This is not real. And then you dive into it. Tolkien says that is complete and utter nonsense. No. What happens is if the author is good at his or her art, what happens is that work creates in your mind, let's use technology language here, computer technology. What that literary work does is it kind of partitions your mind, creates a separate little hard drive, inside which that work can work. In other words, you create a little section of your mind that is Middle Earth. And inside that little section of your mind, as long as Middle Earth is created well, everything works just fine. You traipse along after Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin as they make their way down to Farmer Maggot's house and then down to Crick Hollow, and then across the old forest, and they meet Tom Bomb all the way until Frodo and Sam go off to the Grey Havens. And as long as there is not a jarring problem within that world, everything operates wonderfully. Okay? But if the author isn't as anal as Tolkien in terms of making everything perfect, okay? If the author has problems within the writing, then there might come points when you're reading that little world that is spinning just so beautifully all on its own suddenly goes, "Argh!" And you go, wait a second. Back on page, so-and-so said, This is what often happens, for me at least, when I read Harry Potter. And I teach a course on Harry Potter. I teach a course in London on Harry Potter every other year. I love the Harry Potter novels. I think they are extremely profound once you get into them and start peeling the layers away. But J.K. Rowling is not the writer J.R.R. Tolkien is. For the simple reason, she got to writing so fast and had deadlines that she didn't take care to see that things that she said in books 1, 2, and 3 have to follow through on 4, 5, 6, and 7. Or even in a single book. For example, in Goblet of Fire. You have an event happen on one page, and something happens to a character dies, falls on the ground, and he's only 6 feet away from another character. You turn the page, and the second character is suddenly 20 feet away without having moved. And the dead guy didn't get up and move either, nor did people magically move. It's just really bad copy editing. Writing on her part for not seeing the difference, okay, and then copy editing, okay? Tolkien says that the moment that disbelief arises, that is when you realize, wait a second, he's only supposed to be 6 feet away. Boop, that little world suddenly aborts and you're left outside because a problem has been created in it, okay? So, what happens when you're in that little world? And Tolkien goes on to talk about the kinds of questions Lang said children posed. And Lang said that children want to know, is it true? Is Beowulf real? Is King Arthur real? Is Harry Potter real? Is The Lord of the Rings real? Pick your story. And Tolkien says, yeah, they do ask that question some. But he says, I'm going to use myself as an example. I didn't care whether or not it was true. He says, what was important to me was, did the story awaken or arouse desire? That is, if I was reading a story about dragons, did it awaken in me the desire to see or experience a real dragon? Here's a good modern example. Jurassic Park. The book, not the film. Book is the film's good. Book is so much better. Because when you read the book, yeah, you do want to see those dinosaurs. Until you meet up with Ian Malcolm, the mathematician character, who's like, there's some pretty good reasons why we're separated by 65 million years. For one reason, they eat us. That's a pretty good reason. Okay? I mean, do any of you, do you get what Tolkien's getting at? I mean, do you remember desires you had as a child that you wouldn't necessarily really want to see fulfilled? I mean, I had, and I'll admit, I still have. I would love to see a UFO. Okay? Here's the caveat. I used to say the same thing about a tornado. Until March 10th, 2010, I saw an F4 200 yards away from me, heading straight at me. I don't need to see a tornado again after that. One's fine. Okay, had one a week previous to that. Hit my church when I was at my church. Ripped part of the roof off. It's enough. So when I say I'd like to see a UFO, it's not like up close and personal. Maybe off in the distance, or me standing outside looking at the stars. All of a sudden, have the lights in the sky kind of rearrange. Go, cool. Now go away. Okay. I used to want to see a T-Rex. No. So Tolkien says it needed to awaken desire in him. Right? And he goes on from there to talk about kind of more children in general. But he says, again, in his experience, it'll be plain that, in my opinion, fairy stories should not be especially associated with children. They haven't historically. By the time Tolkien's delivering this essay in 1939, 1938, and then publishing it in 47 and then later on in 65, that fairy stories have been written for children has only been true for less than 100 years, really. Okay? He says, but, having said that, are children associated with fairy stories? Yes, of course. For the simple reason that children are, most of the time, human. And because fairy stories are meant for humans. I don't sit around with my dog, Remus, and tell him stories. Yeah. I had another one that we had to put to sleep this summer named Beowulf. Okay? Because Remus doesn't understand. I can sit around and tell stories with my kids. Okay? So he says, let's say stories do have a sense for being used with children. He goes on and then to discuss, the very word child. It says, child can have a good sense and child can have a bad sense. If we use child in a good sense, we must not allow that to push us into the sentimentality of only using adult or grown-up in a bad sense. See, this is the problem, I think, that Steven Spielberg falls into in so many of his films, where the child is an innocent little being of paradise. And adults are almost always evil. The classic example of this in Steven Spielberg's fantasy oeuvre, let's say, E.T. The original, not the stupid remastered one that he did. Okay? Because in E.T. you have the little kid Elliot, little beautiful cherub-like face and everything, and he sees E.T., and he's not afraid, he's not worried. E.T.'s nice, E.T. just wants to phone home. Okay? Not like H.G. Wells, where E.T. wants to, suck your soul out of you and, all that kind of stuff. Not like Independence Day E.T. Okay? But how are the parents, or how are the adults portrayed in E.T.? Except for the kid's mother. How do you see them? You see them from about here down. Okay? How are in particular, the FBI portrayed? Men in black. And what are they doing when they come to Elliot's house to take E.T.? What are they carrying? Weapons, guns. This is why I said you don't want to use the remastered one. Because in the remastered one, what are they carrying? Walkie-talkies and the most fearful thing a little kid will ever see, a clipboard. I'm serious. They're carrying walkie-talkies and clipboards. Why? Because Spielberg has this anal anti-gun thing. Okay? So, child does have a good sense. Grown-up also has a good sense. Grown-up has a bad sense. Does child have a bad sense? Have you ever told somebody your age to not be childish? Child does have a bad sense. Because what are we meant to do? You're meant to grow up. Okay? That's why you've got this very important passage here where Tolkien says, The process of growing older is not necessarily allied to growing wickeder, though the two do often happen together. Okay? Just because we do grow older doesn't have to mean we grow worse and more evil. Notice he admits, though, that often happens. Okay? Children are meant to grow up and not to become Peter Pans. Because what's Peter Pan's problem?
Who doesn't grow up?
He refuses to grow up. What would a word be that we would use to describe somebody like that?
Arrested development.
Arrested development. Stunted. It's not natural. What's he refusing to do by refusing to grow up? Refusing to accept responsibility? Refusing to accept change? Refusing to accept the world? He's essentially putting his hands over his eyes, his hands over his ears, and going blah, 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 blah. Okay? Trying to shut himself off. So, children are meant to grow up and not to become Peter Pans. Not to lose innocence and wonder. That is, just because you grow up doesn't mean you have to lose innocence and wonder, but to proceed on the appointed journey. It's important. Life is a journey. Do we know what the destination is other than it's the big D? No. We don't know where life's going to take us. Or maybe you do. I sure don't. I don't know what's going to happen 20 minutes from now. I think I'm probably still going to be talking about this lecture. I don't know that for sure. Somebody could come in who I gave an F to earlier this summer. Happens every year in the United States.
I thought you were talking about you.
No, it doesn't happen to me. Sorry, not Superman.
I can eat it at the desk.
Yeah, I'm going to have a whole bunch of drops really fast. Right? But to proceed on the appointed journey, that journey upon which it is certainly not better to travel hopefully than to arrive. In other words, Tolkien's point, and I ought to throw this out here. Remember, Tolkien's Catholic. And he's a meaningful Catholic. That is, he really believes it. He really lives it. He's not just I was baptized Catholic, and goes to church once every 10 years or something. No, I mean, he really believes it and everything. So this kind of informs the essay, especially if we even talk about the epilogue. The point, he says, is to arrive at the destination. But to do so, we must travel hopefully. What does that word hopefully mean? Full of hope. Because if you're full of despair, it would be impossible for me to get from this point to that chair. Because if I'm full of despair, I'd say, well, what's the point? And right here and now. But it is one of the lessons of fairy stories. It's an important word, because Tolkien is telling us. Fairy stories can teach us lessons. If we can speak of the lessons of things that do not lecture. It's why he did not like his good friend C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. Tolkien thought they lectured. They preached. Okay? And a variety of other reasons also. Having Father Christmas show up in Narnia. Doesn't belong, hello. Wouldn't be anachronism, it'd be anachroplacism, an anaplacism or something. Okay? It's out of place. If we can speak of the lessons of things that do not lecture, one of the lessons of fairy stories is that on callow, lumpish, and selfish youth, peril, sorrow, and the shadow of death can bestow dignity and even sometimes wisdom. Okay. These things are not being bestowed on characters in the stories. These things are being bestowed on the readers of stories. The callow, selfish, lumpish youth are the people who read the stories and get transformed by them because of the shadow of death and peril and sorrow in the stories. So what's Tolkien telling us right here about stories? They could change your life. And he doesn't mean that figuratively. He means it literally. A story can change your life. But what must you do? You have to allow it to. You have to let the story do what the story is meant to do. In other words, you cannot approach the story as something to be criticized. But what I mean by that is something to be analyzed. First and foremost, you have to let the author think of the story as water. You've got to let that author pour that water all over you until you're submerged in it. Or to use language C.S. Lewis would use about the stories of George MacDonald when he first read them. He said they baptized his imagination. Think about what that means for a moment. His imagination, which up until that point had been somewhat dark, okay, leading towards, because Lewis had an interest as a teenager and such, leading to the occult. And he says he read George MacDonald, and he had the first, I'm not punning and using this term, the first inkling, yeah, get your chuckles out, the first inkling, okay, of this idea of a good death. That death could be good. Death could be wholesome. Not natural. Not the same thing. Okay? So, Tolkien says, let's don't divide the race into Eloi and Morlocks, pretty children, or elves as the 18th century often idiotically called them. Okay, I've got 4 kids, I'll tell you right now. I don't think there are any quote-unquote pretty children. Pretty, there aren't any perfect kids. The whole idea of the noble savage of Rousseau is completely ludicrous. I don't know if you know much history about Native Americans, but Native American tribes weren't all living in peace and harmony. They were slaughtering each other just as much as when the white man came in and started slaughtering them too. Okay? So, very well, Tolkien says, if adults are to read fairy stories as a natural branch of literature, in other words, if they're going to read them like they're going to read plays, or they're going to read novels, or they're going to read poetry, neither at being children, nor pretending to be choosing for children, nor being boys who would not grow up, what are the values and functions of this kind? Notice the 3 neithers. Okay? Neither playing at being children. Oh, well, I'm reading this because I'm acting like a child. There's a interesting or very strange and disturbing, whichever way you look at it, story a year or so ago of some guy on disability in California. I'm from California, so it's safe for me to say they're always from California. This guy, he weighed like 350, 500 pounds, something like that. And he was on disability because he acted like a baby. He's like 38 years old. And he built for himself. He's a pretty accomplished woodworker. Built for himself a huge crib that he slept in. Dressed in diapers. Made a rattle and stuff. Lived with a woman who took care of him. She got Social Security benefits also for doing this. Okay. And he, considered this a disability. It got on the news. A senator said, what the hell is going on? This is crazy. And he got his disability yanked, and then he tried to sue the senator and a whole bunch of other stuff. He was somebody who was pretending at being a child. This guy was fully functional, fully capable. He just didn't want to go out and face the world. He didn't want to have to go out and get a job. Okay? That's that one class that Tolkien's talking about. What's the other one? Nor pretending to be choosing for children. When my wife was pregnant with my eldest child, I was a doctoral student. I had to go to the doctor one day, the on-campus doctor. And I was reading at the time the complete Winnie the Pooh. Okay? I was reading it for myself because I wanted to reacquaint myself with Winnie the Pooh. And I got into the doctor's office, and I'm sitting in the exam room waiting for her to come in. And she comes in, oh, Winnie the Pooh. And she goes, well, that's kind of a, odd book for a 30-year-old to be reading. And I immediately, well, I'm not reading it for myself. My wife's pregnant. I want to reacquaint. Because I didn't want to look like an idiot. Okay? That's what Tolkien's talking about. Nor being boys who would not grow up, refusing to read anything else. Tolkien says, okay, so if adults are going to read these stories, what are the values and functions of this kind? He says, that's the most important question. Beowulf's been around 1,000 years. Why do we still read it? Other than because, egghead English professors require us to. Personally, I think it's one of, if not the best thing ever written in the English language. I mean, I teach it at the graduate level in Old English. It's so rich, okay? But why do we still read it? Why do Disney and Pixar, etc., come out with what are essentially fairy tales for TV, for film? Why are the biggest box office grossing films essentially fairy tales? Spider-Man is not science fiction. Lord of the Rings is not science fiction. Star Wars isn't even science fiction. They are fairy tales. Star Trek, yeah, it's more science fiction. Okay. Why? Why do we have this need? Okay. Tolkien's going to tell us. First of all, if written with art, that is, if they're well written, the prime value of fairy stories will simply be that value which is literature they share with other literary forms. Notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't tell us what that prime value is. He doesn't state what is the prime value of literature. Why do we read books? Literature, not stupid things like the Harbraith's Handbook or, the World Book of Geography or something. I mean, stories. Why do we read? He doesn't answer that. Why? There is no single answer. It's individual to every person. It does usually have something to do with some of the other things he's going to talk about. Okay? So, but fairy stories offer also, he says, in a peculiar degree or mode, these things: fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation. And he says, and most of these today are considered bad. Okay. Now, he delivered this thing in 1939. They're still considered bad. If a lot of movies you see are quote-unquote escape, then the kinds of reviews you'll read about, oh, this is just escapist claptrap. They don't want to deal with the real world. Well, what if the real world just totally sucks? What if your real world, say, were a prison? Would you want to be reminded 24 hours a day, 60 minutes an hour, 60 seconds a minute that you're in prison and that you'll never get out? And that your whole being is dominated by being in prison? No. So, Tolkien says, let's start with fantasy. And he really starts. I mean, he goes back to the beginning. What's meant by fantasy? Imagination. And every one of you, whether you've seen it kind of in this kind of schematic or something, you know exactly what he's talking about. Because every one of you has had to write a paper before. And what do you do when you have to write a paper? Hopefully, you come up with an idea. Do you just go to your professor and say, Dr. Sherman, I have an idea? And I'll say, great, A. Doesn't work that way, does it? And unfortunately, I'm not Spock. I can't come up and do the whole Vulcan mind meld and go, wow, great idea. Beautiful paper, A. Doesn't work that way. What do you have to do? You have to get that thing that's up here where? Out here. Unfortunately, what tends to happen between up here, where you're Shakespeare, and down here?
Lost in translation.
It gets lost in translation. Okay? There's short-circuiting between up here where you're just complete and utter genius and down here and you're barely writing with a crayon. Okay? Well, what is that? That movement from the idea, the image, the fantasy, that's the imagination. It goes through your art. That's the operative practice. That's the thing that puts it where? Out here. Where everybody else can see it, or hear it, or listen to it, or touch it, or see it if it's a sculpture. Okay? And the thing that you produce, a term paper, a novel, a short story, a poem, a painting, is what Tolkien calls the subcreation. He says it's a subcreation. It's not a creation. Why? Because none of us is God. Only God creates. All we can hope to do in Tolkien's mentality is to rearrange the pieces a bit. Because what are we working with? Stuff that's already there. Even though Tolkien created Balrogs, what did he create them from? Other images of things. Okay? In other words, he dipped his ladle into the soup, as it were, and said, I need a little bit of this, and a little bit of this, and I'll take the horned guy with the pitchfork from the Middle Ages, I'll throw him a little bit of that, and I'll let that mix. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And then he comes up with the word out of his weird Tolkien mindset. Okay? He began writing this kind of stuff. Not this essay, but the Lord of the Rings material. He began coming up with words and such in about 1915, while he was off fighting in World War I in France. He was working on a dictionary of Gnomish. Gnomish words, words of the gnomes. Okay? I mean, you talk about a weird, twisted mind. In fact, later on, he writes an essay called A Secret Vice, talking about how he would, secretly be writing dictionaries of languages that aren't real and grammars of languages, while he's supposed to be working on scholarly research. But he was more interested in talking about, the antecedent of Quinn, in the word quina. What's the origin of this? Like anybody really cares, except for him. And now, a lot of eggheads. Okay? So, you have imagination, you have art, you have subcreation. But he says, I need something that describes this whole aspect. He says, I can't use art because I need a word which embraces both the subcreative art, that is this, and the thing produced. Okay? So he says, this is what we'll do. We'll use fantasy. Fantasy will describe. that whole process. Okay? And he says, what does fantasy mean? It means images of things that aren't actually physically present, Balrogs, hobbits, okay? And it has a couple of qualities. One, arresting strangeness. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Excuse me, what? There lived a what? What's a hobbit, John, or Tollers? Nobody knew what a hobbit was, right? And they're difficult to achieve. I read very little modern fantasy. For the simple reason, you read the master, and everything else, with some exceptions, most everything else is derivative. I mean, where you can go, oh yeah, look, yeah, it's Tolkien. Yeah, there's Gandalf. There's Frodo. Yeah, there's the sidekicks, Merry and Pippin. Yeah, there's the horse. Yeah, cool. Okay, here's an example. Sorry if this offends some of you because you like this one. In the late 70s, the first of a major series, I think Paul knows which one I'm talking about, was published. The Sword of Shannara. I might have Shannara spelled wrong. Okay, by Terry Brooks. The Sword of Shannara is so utterly and bald-faced a rip-off of The Lord of the Rings, it's just not funny. I mean, you have the whole quest thing, you have the White Wizard, you have these half-elves, you got... He does one really cool thing, and it's the twist at the very end. That is a stroke of genius on Terry Brooks' part. But the really bad thing, the druid, the wizard leader, the Gandalf character, and you have to be old enough to understand the reference. His name is Al-Anon. Okay? Al-Anon was a drug rehab program in the 70s. It's like, really, you can't come up with something better than that. I mean, why not just call them AA? Or ah. Okay? Anyways, so he goes on and talks about fantasy and such. It's difficult to achieve. Why? Go back to what I said earlier about creating that world. It's hard to make a world inside which all the laws make total perfect sense. That's why J.K. Rowling, every now and then, it falls flat. That's an example of where Tolkien thought, Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe completely... They go across the river, and they see Father Christmas. Father Christmas is a this world character. What's he doing in Narnia? Why do they even have Christmas in Narnia? What is Christmas? Birthday of Jesus? Is Jesus in Narnia? No. Yes. So maybe it should be Aslan Miss, but it's not. So it doesn't make any sense.
The sacrifice is still in the future at that point.
And the sacrifice is still in the future. I mean, it's like, come on, Jack, you can do better than this. Okay. So, Tolkien goes on to talk about making a secondary world. That's the subcreation. When it's done well, you make this secondary world in your mind. And he talks about this making of the secondary world. To make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible. Just a green sun. We look at the sun and what do we think? Yellow or white, maybe orange or red at sunset. A green sun? Commanding secondary belief will probably require labor and thought, and will certainly demand a special skill, a kind of elvish craft. Few attempt such difficult tasks. Yeah, few do, but who had? As of the time when this lecture was delivered, Tolkien had. Because what had he already published? The Hobbit in 1937. That's why he was asked to do this lecture. Okay? It was because of The Hobbit. It wasn't because of his Beowulf essay, which was published in 1936. His Beowulf essay established him as one of, if not the foremost scholar on Beowulf in the world. But the Andrew Lang people didn't care about that. They cared because he published The Hobbit, which was instantly hailed as a modern fairy tale, a modern classic. So they're like, well, you write fairy tales. He's like, I don't know anything about him. I just told a story to my kids. Okay? So he says, in human art, fantasy is best left to words, to literature. Why? Why is it not best left to... Oh, I'm going to open up a can of worms with this one. Why is it not left to the likes of Peter Jackson?
Oh, but they mentioned the words are like you entering someone else's mind so that you become sub-creator of what their story is saying. Like you see your own picture of the word.
Bingo. The words create the images in your mind. But how do you create the image? I bet if I could ask all of you to describe to a portrait artist, if you had never seen the Lord of the Rings films, I bet we would come up, we've got about 18 people in here, I bet we would come up with 18 rather different images of Gandalf. And not one of them would look like Ian McKellen. Unfortunately now, though, you say Gandalf and everybody sees Ian McKellen. You say Frodo and everybody sees Bug-eyed, Elijah Wood. Sorry, Bug-eyed Boy is my word for him. Okay. Be better playing Tolkien. Okay? Elijah Wood. Or Aragorn and you see Viggo Mortensen. Completely miscast. Why? Because Aragorn isn't supposed to be handsome. He's not supposed to be someone that women would fall over trying to get to or fight each other trying to get to. You're supposed to look at him and go, kind of rough looking. Okay? You slather mud all over Viggo Mortensen and he's not rough looking. Okay? So, Tolkien goes on. Talks about why it's best left to true literature. And then he mentions drama. And says, argue why, drama wouldn't really work. And I would use as, if I were presenting a case in court as piece of evidence A, B, C, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, The Lord of the Rings, Two Towers, The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. Because the films are not The Lord of the Rings. They are Peter Jackson's, I'll be generous, adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. Okay, now I'll not be generous. They are Peter Jackson's bastardization of The Lord of the Rings. They are his emasculation of The Lord of the Rings. They are his corruption of The Lord of the Rings. For this simple reason, Peter Jackson doesn't have a rat's idea of what Tolkien means in The Lord of the Rings. He doesn't know what they're about. He thinks they're about sword and sorcery. They are as far from swords and sorcery as you can get. Yes, there are swords. Yes, there is sorcery. But last time I read the novel, Yoda and what's Christopher Lee's character in the Count Dooku are nowhere in The Lord of the Rings. Yet they are in the films. And we even see them get to redo their wizard's duel thing, which is not in The Lord of the Rings. Okay? We'll talk about more of this later. So he goes on to fairy and drama. Okay? What's the difference between fairy and drama and class I come to before this class, Shakespeare. What's the difference between a Fairerian drama and Hamlet? What do you know when you're watching Hamlet?
You know they're all gonna die.
Okay. What else? Good understanding of Hamlet. What else do you know?
It's a play.
It's a play. In other words, it's not really Hamlet. Or let me use a better example. A Midsummer Night's Dream. So that when Bottom, in the play within the play, comes up off the stage after the character of Pyramus has died, and Bottom goes, "Oh, but I'm not really dead. I don't want you to think, ladies, that I'm..." Of course you're not really dead, stupid. You're an actor. But Bottom is so stupid, he's afraid that people will think that he's really dead. Okay? The difference? A Fairerian drama? Now, I don't know if any of you have ever experienced a Fairerian drama. I haven't. Because in a Fairerian drama, that's where you see something that comes across as so real, you believe it. Kind of like maybe alien abductions. Seeing the little people off in the forest. Like, you can go to England today, Scout's honor, cross my heart, swear on a stack of Bibles, the whole 9 yards. You can go to England today and talk to people who will swear they have seen fairies or elves or the little people. And I don't mean because they're high on coke or something. I mean out traipsing through the woods or something and they come across a fairy ring. Anybody know what a fairy ring is? Circle of mushrooms. Don't ever go into one of those. Because according to Celtic mythology, fairy rings can be portals to the other world. Okay? And what Tolkien's talking about here is largely what we see in a lot of medieval literature. Where people do see things that they attribute primary belief to, that it really happened. Whereas those of us who are jaded and unbelieving like me, go, yeah, right. Prove it. Prove it. Well, you can't prove it, okay? So, Tolkien says, we need a word for that elvish craft. That elvish craft that can produce that sense of belief. Enchantment. But what does enchantment mean? To be enchanted. Chant, like sung. In, within. In other words, to come like within the song. Now that's beautiful when you think about what that really means. I'll say this about Peter Jackson. One clip I've seen of the upcoming Hobbit movies, 2 of them.
3.
What in God's name will he add to the novel to make it into 3 films? I can shudder to think. Is the scene when the dwarves are singing in Bilbo's hole. From that one part that I've seen, that's pretty good. Except the dwarves are all wrong. Okay? Other than that.
It's pretty good, except where it's completely wrong.
No, their chanting of the music is what's really good. Just take their faces away and have the sound, kind of a thing. Okay. So what does enchantment do? It's this: shared enrichment. It's not designed to take you over and make you into their slave, even though that is sometimes what happens in medieval literature. You get, some sexy fairy queen comes and sings to you, and you go off and become her sex slave for however many years, and then you come back all worn out and wasted. Right. Okay. Or the other way around, It's shared enrichment. What does that mean? You experience this thing, this drama, let's say, And what happens? You then turn and look at the world around you, and you see it differently. Greens are greener, reds are redder, water is wetter. It is more watery. Okay? Air feels cleaner. You love more deeply. You sorrow more greatly. In other words, all of life kind of takes on an added dimension. Right? So, he goes on from there and says, to the elvish craft, enchantment, fantasy aspires. This is hoping for this. Right? How many of you have read Lord of the Rings? Okay, I don't care when. Now let me just say this now. You need to read The Lord of the Rings. You cannot rely on the films. You will fail if you try to rely on the films. The changes are significant in the films. That's why I say it's Peter Jackson. It's not J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Okay? For those of you who, how many of you have read The Lord of the Rings multiple times? Any? Only one of you willing to. Okay? First time I read Lord of the Rings and actually finished it. The reason I say this is because the first time I read it, I got like 50 pages into Fellowship of the Ring. I thought, it's not working for me. Put it down.
I got, was Bree.
Yeah.
I just got stuck at Bree.
Yeah, it was
I
something.
could go back, read The Hobbit, and that gave me about enough momentum to actually power through Bree and even Bombadil, which really takes some.
I think it was Bombadil for me. Okay, I stopped. I went off, read something else. I came back, started again. And I don't know what, but when I came back and started again, I read through all 3 novels in like 2 days. I was, 16, 17 years old. And when I read them, I mean, you talk about enchantment. I mean, when when Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli are chasing after Merry and Pippin, I was out of breath reading. I mean, I was right there in Middle Earth. He had me hook, line, and sinker. Okay, since that time, I probably read them, 30 or 50 times. Not quite every year. Christopher Lee, the guy who plays Saruman, has read The Lord of the Rings every year since 1954, since they came out. Thankfully, he was able to get Peter Jackson to change some things that Peter Jackson wanted to do. Because Christopher Lee knew Tolkien. He said, you can't do this, kind of a thing. Okay? So, going on and talking about that, the element of fantasy, that fantasy wants to aim at enchantment. Tolkien says, for a lot of people, this idea of enchantment, you're playing tricks with the world. You're changing the real world and stuff. And he says, I once had a person say to me that myth and fairy story were like lies. I mean, think about it. Little Red Riding Hood. Did it really happen? If not, then it's a lie. Did, Luke or did Darth Vader really rescue Luke? No, it's a lie. It's not a fairy story. It's not a story. It's not a myth. Because if it's not factually true, it's false, which makes it a lie. So he says, as for its legitimacy, that is the legitimacy of fantasy and such, I will say no more than to quote a brief passage from a letter I once wrote to a man who described myth and fairy story as lies. Though to do him justice, he was kind enough and confused enough to call fairy story making breathing a lie through silver. Now think about what that means. What does the silver do as you breathe the lie through it? It covers it and makes it all nice and shiny and pretty and appealing. You could say, it's like breathing a lie through gold, in which case you gilt it. You make it something desirable. Does it make it any less of a lie? No. Who's the person he's writing to? C.S. Lewis. This was C.S. Lewis that said this. Okay? That said, fairy stories are a lie. So Tolkien writes as part of a letter in this poem. Dear sir, I said, although now long estranged, man is not wholly lost nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. Keep in mind, Tolkien's Catholic. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white. What's the white? God. And each individual, therefore, every individual who has lived, is a single ray of that whole white. In other words, we're all a little element in the prism that refract that light and that split off a little color. Man, too many hues and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Well, what are the things that are moving from mind to mind? Little slivers of light. Okay? Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods and their houses out of dark and light, just think of the Roman gods or the Greek gods, and sowed the seed of dragons, 'twas our right. 'Twas our right. In other words, it is part and parcel of who we are, used or misused. Can you think of some literature, some stories, some ideas that are misused light? Or some creations? How about pornography? Is the human body designed for pornography? Or is that a misusing, a misappropriation of something that is supposed to be beautiful, and etc.? Yes. That right has not decayed, we make still by the law in which we're made. In other words, we make because we're those little images of God that Catholic doctrine, Christian doctrine talks about. That's why Tolkien follows that with. Fantasy is a natural human activity. It's not bad. It's not wrong. It does not destroy or even insult reason. It does not either blunt the appetite for nor obscure the perception of scientific verity. The keener and the clearer is the reason, the better fantasy will it make. Okay? And then you get this paragraph down there. For creative fantasy is founded upon the hard recognition that things are so in the world as it appears under the sun, on a recognition of fact, not a slavery to it. Now you have to unpack this though. Okay? Creative fantasy is founded upon the hard recognition that things are so in the world as it appears under the sun. Creative fantasy, the kind of fantasy Tolkien is talking about. This fantasy that aspires to enchantment, shared enrichment, where we share something that the author has to show us. Where the author is saying, come here, look at this. This will blow you away. And then goes, like it's pixie dust, and it changes our perceptions. Okay? So that's the kind of fantasy. But notice, it's founded upon, it's based on what? What's this hard recognition? What does fantasy say?
Well, fantasy doesn't change the entire world. It just does not depict an entirely different world. It depicts a recognizable world in which certain elements are different.
Yes. It acknowledges what about this world? It's a hard recognition. A recognition is an acknowledgement. It's an awareness of what? Things are so in the world as it appears under the sun. Well, how does the world, our world, appear under the sun? Keep going. Is it all beautiful?
No.
Does everyone die happily ever after, a la Disney? No.
Well, in our world is really static, and I feel like fantasy is just another medium for us to become more dynamic.
Okay. Can be. Was
Flying is not interesting unless you have gravity first.
Say that again?
Flying is not interesting unless gravity works there the same way it does here.
Yeah.
Unless you have the possibility
Yeah.
of falling on your ass and breaking your head, then flying is really nothing at all.
Why are things things in the world as appears under the sun a hard recognition? Because sometimes we don't want to acknowledge that there really are people maybe trying to hurt someone. Let's not, I don't want to go into the whole terrorism thing right now. We don't want to acknowledge that children die of cancer. We don't want to acknowledge that 23 million Americans are out of work. We don't want to acknowledge that 48%, I think I read this the other day, I can't believe that it's true, it's got to be wrong. 48% of Americans are on food stamps. It can't be right. That's a hard recognition if that's true. My mind can't wrap itself around that. Okay? That, people owe more in student loans than they do in credit card and mortgage debt put together. That's true, by the way. Okay? We don't want to acknowledge that there's poverty, there's famine, there's war, there's all these horrible things. We don't want to acknowledge, especially those of you who are 20 or 30 years younger than me, that you will die. How do we know that we don't want to acknowledge that? Because when do we think it will happen? Long time in the future. And not with some crazy ex-student coming into a classroom. Not some whacked out job going to a movie theater and just opens fire. Not pick your horror. Okay? That's a hard recognition. That this world is not perfect. It is not even close to being perfect. Okay? So what would it mean if it stopped right there? That's kind of dreary. That's why Tolkien says, upon a recognition of fact. The facts are, life really can be tough. But not a slavery to it. In other words, what can creative fantasy say? Or what can it offer? Hope. It can say, yes, there is death and destruction, but what can it even show in death and destruction? Courage, camaraderie, nobility of character. If you were to take this and apply it, let's say, to the shooting in Aurora, Colorado, the slavery effect would be, oh, look at how all those poor people died, or Virginia Tech, or any other mass shooting almost that has occurred.
Like
Okay?
people saving each other.
Exactly.
Standing in front of each other, giving their life.
There's, 3 boyfriends that I can remember who dove in front of their girlfriends. Okay? There was a recognition of fact. This guy's going to kill us. But they weren't slaves to it. They attempted to change the facts. And they did to some extent. Other people lived, though they died. Which is why Frodo says at the end of The Lord of the Rings, Sam, I wanted to save the Shire, and the Shire has been saved. But not for me. And that's how it must be sometimes. Someone must give something up so that somebody else can enjoy it. It's the nature of sacrifice. Okay? And that's largely what Tolkien is kind of getting at there. So, he goes from there to talk about the other 3 ideas. recovery, escape, and consolation, which we don't have a lot of time, but I've got 4 minutes. Okay? He goes on and talks a little bit more about fantasy, but he goes more directly into recovery. And recovery is pretty easy. Recovery is regaining of a clear view. And what he means by that is none of us see clearly. None of us see clearly. Why? Because for one reason, we've all been alive too long. And what do I mean by that? We think we know what we see. Or we think we see what we know. Where do you see this more? In our families. The people we see day in, day out, that we tend to do what? With or for?
Take for granted.
Yeah, we take them for granted. Because I've seen my wife, not every day, because I've been on trips and things like that, or she's been on trips, but almost every day for the last 27 and a half years, what do I assume? That I'll see her tomorrow, and the next day, 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 until she goes to work and gets killed by a car. Or goes off to work and has some crazy idiot fly a plane into a building. And then you never see them again. Then what happens? Are your eyes opened? Oh yeah. Is it painful? Oh yeah. So Tolkien says we need to develop a sense to see the world around us. What does that mean? It's not just going, oh, look, a tree. It's seeing a tree as if you had never seen a tree before in your life. Like you were blind from birth, and all of a sudden, Jesus came, touched your eyes, and you're like, what in the blankety, 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 blank is that? Well, that's a tree. Okay? There's a wonderful YouTube video of a woman born deaf. She's like 28 years old. And she either gets a cochlear implant or she has some other kind of surgery and she can hear all of it. And I don't mean just like that. I mean, she hears clearly. She's married and she hears her husband's voice for the very first time. And the tears are, I mean, it's like both spigots are turned on all the way. Okay? That's what Tolkien's talking about. He's talking about removing the fog from our eyes. Seeing things, he says, not as they really are. He says, seeing things as they were meant to be seen. Most importantly, people. Seeing people is not being an extension of ourselves, but is really, truly, fully separate. Because all too often we walk around and we just see people only in the sense of relation to ourselves. That's my friend, that's somebody I don't know. But notice, that's I don't know. That's a relationship. Rather than, wow, look at that person. And it does come down even into coming into a classroom and seeing when the light comes on, not just walls, concrete block that is textured, that has mortar between it, floors made out of God knows what, ceilings with individual tiles, with individual little holes in the tiles. Paying what? Attention to everything around you. That's what he means by recovery. We can recover a sense, Tolkien is getting at, of the glory of everything, of existence even. Beautiful scene, and we'll stop with this, in the 7th Harry Potter novel. After Harry loses his wand and he thinks life's just crap. I mean, just the bottom is falling out. And it's Christmas morning and he's sitting on a hillside And the narrator says, and Harry ought to be filled with a sense of wonder to be alive on this day, looking out at this beautiful panoramic scene of snow on the hills of Scotland and everything. And instead, he's all wrapped up inside himself. He needs recovery. And he gets it in the very next chapter. All right, we'll stop there. We'll try and start. We will start. Silmarillion. I may cut Silmarillion